All right, today we're going to leave Egypt. Any future references to Egypt will be in conjunction with other places and at later times. We're going to now move to the land of Canaan, where the Israelites were invading the last time we saw them. We want to get a little bit of background, a little review of the history that we've been looking at so far and from the Old Testament. So first screen we're going to look at here will show us some of where we've been and some of where we're going. So first of all, we have the time of the patriarchs. Okay, who do we think of when we think of the patriarchs? What names come to mind?
Abraham
and
Jacob,
and then all his sons of the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, we move from the patriarchs to the time of the Egyptian captivity. Who was it that was brought down into Egypt initially? Joseph, and then eventually the whole family came down. Who was it that was driven out that brought about the enslavement of the Israelites? Who was driven out of Egypt that were relatives? Michael?
the Hyksos.
Hyksos, right. The captivity in Egypt ended with the Exodus. Who brought the children of Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus? Drew? Moses. Okay, I'm giving some easy questions here. See if we can get the juices flowing. And of course, after the Exodus, they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years because of their disobedience to God and trusting Him in entering the land. All right, so the next stage is the conquest of the Promised Land. Who is it that leads the Israelites into the Promised Land to conquer it? All right, Joshua. And what was the first battle? This famous song. Joshua did the battle of Jericho. Yeah. You didn't sing it. Joshua did the battle of Jericho. Yeah, okay, that's better. And everybody together. And the walls came tumbling down. All right. So you are familiar with that. All right. And of course they have to proceed from there in conquering the rest of the land. So we're going to see some of that in our study in this section. Then we enter, after they come into the land, we enter into the time of the judges. Who are some judges that you know of? Anybody stand out as a judge? We'll be reading this later.
Samson.
Samson was a judge. Anybody else? Deborah.
The one went with Deborah, Barak.
Right.
Samuel.
Samuel was considered a judge. He's at the end of the book of Judges, or in the beginning of 1 Samuel. Is that it? How about Gideon? Remember Gideon? All right, we'll be looking at some of those when we get to that point as well. Following the period of Judges, we enter the united monarchy. That is when Israel is united under a king. Anybody know who the first king was?
King Saul.
Saul. And then, after 3 kings, who followed Saul? Everybody say it together.
David.
And then who followed David?
Solomon.
Solomon. After Solomon died, the kingdom is divided. And the divided kingdom up to the time of Jonah covers those years. All right, so some of that is where we have been, and some of it is where we're going in relationship to Old Testament history, and particularly in the land of Canaan. All right, some of the early inhabitants of Canaan I bring to you because they do come up in different passages in the Old Testament, and I want you to at least recognize something about them and maybe know how to pronounce their name. All right, the first one is a group of people called the Rephaim. I am at the end of a word. I think maybe I've told you this before. What does I am on the end of a word indicate? Maybe I haven't. Nobody knows? It means plurality. So, for example, we have the cherubim, which are what? Angels. So cherubim indicates that there's more than one of them. One of them would be a cherub. A Okay. All right. So anytime you see I am, it indicates plurality. So the Rephaim, talking about a group of people. They are aboriginal giants in Canaan, Edom, and Moab. So anytime you see Rephaim, they're talking about people that are giants. We've talked about that before. We have Ammon, or the Ammonites. Particularly Og, the king of Bashan, is mentioned as their leader. Yes?
I heard, I was watching this one thing on the pyramids, and it was like how they were built and stuff.
Mhm.
And like a lot of people were saying that the reason that the pyramids were built was because giants built them.
Giants built them. How big are giants we talking here?
I don't know, like 10 feet tall.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess it would be easier for a giant to move a 2.5 ton stone than it would be someone who's only 5 feet tall. But I'm still not sure that a 10-foot tall person is going to be able to move it either. You know, they're so huge. But maybe did they offer any evidence of that?
No, they were just.
Yeah, speculation. Just like some say aliens came down and built it, or things like that. So yeah, all kinds of speculation which are based on no evidence. So we know where to put that. It's called a circular file. All right, so next we have the Zuzim, or if you really like saying those Z's, you can call them the Zamzumim. You got M's and Z's. And they're mentioned there. The Emim, the Horim, again you see the Em on the end, also called Horites or Hurrians, the Avim, the Anakim. Here's another group of giants, the Anakim, and the Amorites. So these are all people that are early inhabitants of the land of Canaan. Any questions?
When did like the giants like stop like because I know we don't nearly have anybody as tall as.
Yeah, we do have. There are some giants today. They seem to run in families because here you got a whole tribe of people that are large. I know that I'm not sure if they're still giants or not, but at one time in Africa, I think it was the Watusi were considered giants. They were really tall tribes. Within their tribe, there was that. Now, as groups of people begin to intermarry with other groups, their particular characteristics become less pronounced. So whether that happened or whether everybody just was so afraid of the giants they killed them whenever they could, I don't know. But yeah, we do have some giants today. There are people from time to time that fit that description. But certainly not whole tribes of people like we have back here.
I mean, like they're like they were all like 10 feet tall back then and stuff like that. But like I've seen so many things about tall people, and none of them are 10 feet tall. Just like 7 foot, 8 foot stuff.
Yeah, which is tall for us, but not 10. Yeah, there. If you look at like Guinness Book of World Records, places like that, you can still find tallest person on Earth, and usually they're around that height. But yeah, only like one person in the world, or a couple people in the world now.
Don't people usually that tall die really young because they're just too tall?
Yeah, that's part of the problem is their bones and stuff maybe don't grow enough to handle the height. They have a lot of different problems usually. Yeah. Or they get hit in the head with a stone. that tends to lessen the lifespan too. All right. Any other questions about these different groups? These are all people that live in the land of Canaan. So when Joshua was told to go in and conquer the land, it's not just one group of people. There's all kinds of people. And of course, who was it that some of the spies saw? Well, they saw either the Anakim or the Rephaim, because remember they came back and said there's giants in there. Remember that? Okay, so now we come to the tribes of the patriarchal area. So a lot of that was before Abraham came into the land, and these are some of the peoples that lived there from Abraham on. Now, the general term for people that lived in the land of Canaan, surprise, surprise, was Canaanites. But Canaanites isn't a specific description necessarily of people. Now, there were people that were distinctly Canaanites. In other words, they were descendants of Canaan, who was the son of Ham. And it's after them that the whole land is named, the land of Canaan. But as time goes on, more and more people come in, different tribes come in to live there. And if you lived there, you were called a Canaanite, whether you were a descendant of Canaan or not. You follow? So all these people are not Canaanites, but they're called Canaanites because they're living in Canaan. It's like anybody who lives in America is called an American. That's probably not a good example because we have so many different, well, maybe it is. People who come to live here from another country, and you say, what are you? You say, I'm an American. Well, they weren't born an American, but they consider themselves to be now because they live here. All right. So here's some of the groups that are living in the land during the time of the patriarchs. We had the Phoenicians, so we're going to spend more time talking about them. The Ammonites, they were descendants of Ammon. The Jebusites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, Philistines, Hittites, Amorites, and Girgasites. Now, you've probably heard of some of those, and probably some of them you've never heard of, right? Which one have you never heard of? I'll bet none of you ever heard of the Girgasites, right? That sounds like a disease that you have in your throat or something. Parasite sounds like an animal that lives on you. But some of the rest of these you've probably heard of. All right, so now we want to go to the golden age of Palestine, or Palestine is a more modern word we use for the land of Canaan. All right, so sometimes you'll see that. Sometimes you'll see it called Syria Palestine, because Syria is the area north, and Palestine is considered this area. So lumping it all together, we call it Syria Palestine. So the golden age, in other words, when all these tribes were doing really well, was an age brought in by the Hyksos. So remember, the Hyksos were Amorites who came in and lived in this land, and they were a very civilized group of people. They established what is called a city-state system. We've talked about that before. That was the first governments we saw in Sumer and beyond, was city-state. That is, the city is the government of an area. You don't have a state over that or a country over that. Each city is its own government, its own country, essentially. And if you lived outside the city, you might look to that city to protect you, and so you would fall under that city-state. But the city-state itself was the government. Any questions about that? Is that clear? The northwest coast became a cultural center, which is Phoenicia, so along here. And they included the cities of Tyre, which you see there, Sidon, which is not pictured, it should be in there, and Byblos, which is up here. Those are the three main cities of Phoenicia. Now, during the late Bronze Age, 1500 to 1400, Egypt dominated. Remember, we talked about that. When the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt, that was a time when Egypt dominated all the way up into the land of Canaan. And they took over from the Hyksos governmental system. So when they drove the Hyksos out of Egypt, they didn't stop there. They kept going and took over the land of Canaan where the Hyksos had control. So the Hyksos brought culture and achievement and economic prosperity into the land of Canaan. But when they were driven out of Egypt, they also were driven out of the land of Canaan. So Egypt took over. You follow that? Make sense? Egypt, however, didn't contribute to the land like the Hyksos had. The Hyksos brought prosperity to the land, but the Egyptians took prosperity away from the land. They just saw the land of Canaan as a place where they could get what they wanted. So instead of cultivating it, all they were interested in was getting money out of them. So they just required them to pay taxes to them and didn't look out for what was good for the land of Canaan itself. And so because of that, because they're being drained of their resources, the land of Canaan goes into a time of decline. Any questions about that? Do you see how that would happen? All right. Next, I want to look at a group of people that were in the land of Canaan at the time called the Hittites. See here, the Hittite Empire. Now, the Hittites at one time had control over this part of Asia Minor and then down into Syria. So just north of the area of Palestine, or north of the land of Canaan. But they're in the region and into what is called Syria. Now the Hittites are a people that many scholars for a long time did not believe existed. They didn't find any evidence for them except in the Bible. And of course, if you don't find evidence outside the Bible, you assume the Bible must be wrong, according to many scholars. What they found was, as archaeologists were digging in this area, I think it was the late 19th, early 20th century, they found a civilization that they did not know was there, and it was the Hittites, and found that they were a very, very strong civilization and kingdom, and the fact that they hadn't heard of them before didn't mean they didn't exist. They did. And so the Hittites had a great influence upon that part of the world. Let's see, this one shows a further expanse of the Hittites over to this area, and also shows that at the time, as Egypt was conquering or had taken over this area from the Hyksos, that they come in conflict with the Hittites up here. And then you remember, who was it that, what Pharaoh was it that ended up fighting a battle against the Hittites? Just on your quiz, I think. Jordan. Ramses II, remember? Do you remember the location? What was that? Kadesh, yes. So they fought a battle in Kadesh, and remember the result of it was that it was basically a tie, and they established a peace treaty between them. But you can see why they were in conflict. Here's the Hittite Empire, down here's the Egyptian Empire, and so there was conflict between them. There's Ramses II right there. All right, any questions about the Hittites? They weren't an advanced civilization, but there's not a lot really for me to tell you about them without getting into a lot of detail that we do not find all that interesting. All right, we're going to move on to the next group of people, and you'll find them more interesting, the Phoenicians. I'm sure you've heard of the Phoenicians. In some class in the past, have you talked about the Phoenicians? Anybody? Yeah? Do you remember what class? In middle school, maybe? No? How many have never heard of the Phoenicians before? Okay, so almost everybody has heard of them at least. Okay, maybe the rest of you just weren't listening. All right, let's look at the Phoenicians. First of all, we see the Phoenicians were known as the merchants of the Mediterranean. They're the merchants of the Mediterranean. Their greatest expansion took place after the time of David. So we're kind of fast forwarding a little bit past when the Israelites are in the land and they have conquered the land mostly. They have some issues with the Philistines, but eventually they have a king, Saul, King David, and about that time is when the Phoenicians began to develop their merchant shipping. They used ships to go out into the Mediterranean. They became expert sailors. So because they lived on the coast, that provided them a good impetus then to move out onto the sea. Tyre, in fact, here has an island right off its coast, which had a great harbor, and also made them well defended. And in fact, we'll find later that the people of Tyre, if there's an invasion coming, simply move out onto the island, and then nobody can get them.
Yeah.
So pretty cool. But it also gave them lots of docking area for ships to dock. So Tyre, especially Sidon, and Byblos are the three main cities of Phoenicia, and they are shipping cities. Now, the Phoenicians weren't content with just staying here and trading around the Mediterranean. They went all the way to the edge of the Mediterranean and established a colony over here, Carthage. And we'll see Carthage has great importance later on. But these are Phoenicians over here. I think that they also, this map shows them going along the coast up here, maybe up to England. I think they also went down around Africa. They seem to be great seamen and went a long ways, possibly even to America.
Didn't Rome get in a war with Carthage?
Yes, that's where we'll spend some time looking at that later. That's after Phoenicia really isn't around so much anymore, but their colony Carthage will be. So the Phoenicians became the greatest merchants of their day. The use of iron, which they got from the Hittites, facilitated acquiring and employing Lebanon to obtain timber. So Lebanon is north of the area, so they were able to use iron that they got from the Hittites to cut down trees, things like that, so that they could have timber to make their boats, and also then they would carry timber to other places and sell it. So that was one of their items that they would sell. Some of the other items that they would sell, and in addition to this natural resource, timber is one of the two natural resources that they traded, and the second was purple dye. The purple dye came from a type of mollusk. You know what a mollusk is? Shake your heads. You know what a mollusk is? Okay. The particular one's called a murex. So they would gather these murex. They lived in the Mediterranean Sea, and they discovered how to make a purple dye from the murex. Now, do you know where they got the liquid in order to make the dye?
I can't remember what it was, but some shell.
Yes, the murex is it's a mollusk, which is a shellfish. They would take the inside and they would squeeze it. And out of each murex, you would get one drop, which would be used as purple dye. Now, if you're thinking about dyeing a garment, how many murex would it take to have enough dye to dye a whole robe? A lot, right? So what would that do to the price of purple dye? It would go way up. Now they did have there was another purple dye they had before this, but the dye they got from the murex lasted longer. It was more permanent. It didn't wash off. And so that's why purple became associated with royalty, because they're the only ones that could afford it. You had to be really wealthy in order to have something dyed purple. All right, so those are the two natural resources that they traded were timber, from which they made ships, from the cedar and fir trees in Lebanon, and then purple dye from the type of mollusk. Now, in addition, the Phoenicians specialized in manufacturing 3 kinds of glass made from the white sand found along their coastline. So they made use of the resources that were there. Now, they didn't sell the sand, but they found a way to make the sand in the glass.
Do you know what type of murex they use, or they just all?
I don't know if murex are divided up into different kinds or not.
There's aqua murexes, and there's murexes, and pink sided murexes.
How do you know that?
I'm a shellfish.
Wow, she's a mythological gods freak and a shell freak. We're finding out more and more interesting things about Victoria as we go along. I would, if I had to guess, I would say the rose murex, because it's kind of reddish, but I don't know. Whether it was one in particular, probably. If you squeeze an apple murex, probably wouldn't get purple. I don't know. You would get something lighter colored, like cyan. Okay. If you want to find out for us, that would be interesting. All right. So they made 3 different kinds of glass from the sands, the white sands of the beach. The first one was a transparent, colorless glass, which would be used for mirrors and common objects such as vases, urns, bottles, and jugs. So let's see, do we have one of those in the picture? I don't remember if there's one here. I don't see one. So, so we have transparent glass, and you've seen that. You have things like that yourself. Next, they made a semi-transparent colored glass. These were the most beautiful objects produced by the Phoenicians. And they consisted of small flasks or bottles, 3 to 6 inches. So I think it would be these. They were probably intended to contain perfumes. They used small jugs, small vases, And some of them would be pointed at the end, like this one is. They're colored with either longitudinal or in horizontal stripes and bands. Thought that would go away, it just kept getting louder. Or horizontal stripes, like you see here. Often deviating in zigzags, which you see on this one, and sometimes deflecting into crescents or curves. So you see some curves maybe up in here. So that's the semi-transparent colored glass. All right, the third kind of glass was called opaque. Are you familiar with that word? Have you had that in science? What's it mean to be opaque? Joel?
Can't see through it.
Right. So these are like porcelain. Are you familiar with porcelain? Have you seen anything with porcelain? Maybe some of your parents have some things like that. And the coloring was obtained by using different metallic oxides, and so they would color the glass with that. So that would be like this. That would be opaque. Not sure which one that's probably one of the smaller, semi-transparent. All right, in addition to these things, and they sold a lot of things. You can see other items here. These are things made out of metal they got from the Hittites. Of course, they had cloth that was dyed purple. Here's some of the flasks and so on that they sold. But they sold many things.
Did people like ever rob their boats to take all their goods?
Well, I'm sure there may have been pirates that tried, but they would be armed as well. You know, they've got daggers. So there are always people who are trying to rob. So I've not read anything about it, but I'm sure that they were able to handle themselves. The last thing that they sold was papyrus. That was an important product for them, and it came particularly from the city of Byblos, which was the main center for selling papyrus. And because they had all this paper and produced books here, the word Byblos became our word for book. Because paper that came from there was from Byblos, so they called the paper that was put together into book, and that's where we get our word Bible. Bible simply means book. There's one more thing that we have from the Phoenicians that they're credited with giving us, and that is the alphabet. They are given credit for originating the alphabet. You can see the beginnings of it in Sinaitic script. Here's a description of an ox head. The Hebrew name is Aleph, and then the Phoenicians change it a little bit, and eventually it becomes a letter. So the Phoenicians used pictures, eventually made them into letters, and then they became parts of words rather than a symbol of the whole word. So that's an important part of their continuity. Okay, we'll look at their religion next time.